So, if you wouldn't mind telling us, like, about you, if we could kind of like kick off with that, like, your background, your interests, your qualifications, and what you're up to.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, Matt, as you probably tell by accent, unfortunately, even though I've been here more than half my life in Australia, I mean, I grew up in the northern suburbs of London, and I actually decided that I would come to Australia when I was 14, and I first got the paperwork when I was 16 from the Australian Embassy in Trafalgar Square, and it took a few years. But basically, I came over to do managed to come over and to do my PhD, which I did on cane toads. And really, but now I'm living outside Cooktown on a farm, just a small farm on the Endeavour Valley Road. It's the road that goes through to Hopevale. Mm. And I had a farm down in northern New South Wales, and I was very much growing food organically there. And it was really, I suppose, over the last few decades, been a transition from working with endangered species, working with pest species like cane toads, feral cats, and things like that, and to be more interested in that, so much of our land is being given over for growing food for agriculture. And we're busy sort of trying to maintain all these biodiversity within these nature reserves and national parks, and so many threats on them. And meanwhile, what was happening out in the agricultural landscape, we were losing biodiversity. We now know we were losing huge amounts of carbon, other sort of environmental issues. And so I became more interested in sort of, working with farmers through land care, through catchment management, to support them to improve what they were doing. Within obviously the sort of the confines, like everybody else, of, the need to make an income. So I worked in land care and catchment management, but I look back now, Matt, and I sort of think, talk about sort of, your topic, sort of looking into curiosity. And I was looking at thinking how many years I've spent working with farmers and doing in my own small farm, growing food sustainably. And so basically maintaining, so your whole goal was to maintain the soil, the growing conditions that you had. And you would use a whole lot of inputs and compost and biofertilizers and mulch and things like that to do that. And when I moved up to Cooktown, like a lot of other people who sort of first come to Cooktown, I was just passing through, and then that seems to be the sort of pattern that we end up staying. And I part of the reason why I stayed, but I think I would have stayed anyway, is I got the job to sort of kickstart the land care program on Cape York Peninsula. So I was sort of busy doing that. I was working in town, living in town, but doing up a house with the idea to buy a farm outside of town, and to really just sort of experiment with how I could use more of my ecological backgrounds in terms of the way that I grew food and delving into the science behind it. And what's come from that has been a journey that's been sort of 15 years, I suppose, learning practically on the farm, and learning through being, my background in research, and sort of starting to realize that they were looking at regenerative agriculture, looking at what worked, what didn't work, and developing more of an eco-logical approach to regenerative agriculture at any scale. So when I talk about the word agriculture, I mean, it's the growing, it's the cultivation of food. So it can be in people's food gardens, or it can be, 6,000 acre property.
At an industrial scale. Well, that's very interesting, I must say. And look, you've said it's crazy to ignore the intelligence embedded in natural ecosystems, especially since nature has undertaken the research and development in every growing condition on the planet, including our own. Would you mind expanding on that?
Yeah, well, if you look at, so I'm going to get political now, I'm sure you don't mind, but if you look at the way that so much of the funding is at the moment, it's all about agri-tech. It's all about developing technologies to solve growing issues.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's no problem with that. Drones, laser levelers, GPS-guided tractors, all of those. So there's no problem with those. But what I feel is that there's a, you know, you're sort of saying is that there's 3 billion years of research and development embedded in natural systems, and why aren't we learning more from those? And that's where obviously the business name comes from, learning from nature. But it's also sort of interesting, Matt, as well, is that we and you know, and I'm sort of guilty of this too, is that what we do is we go out and if we're a gardener, we sort of think, right, what's wrong with my soil? It's a bit compacted. Mm-hmm. What are my neighbors doing? And we might sort of say, oh, somebody's putting on, oh, obviously they're putting on mulch and they're putting on compost, but somebody's buying some dolomite, or it might be gypsum, or it might be lime, or whatever. And if you're more into doing it more commercial, you'll get a soil test. Mm-hmm. And it will come out with all of these different recommendations, and they might be for either chemical inputs or for organic inputs. And then above ground, we've got various problems with pests and diseases and things like that. But really, what I realized is that all of those things are symptoms, they're indicators that the actual ecosystems in our farms and gardens aren't working well. Mm. So let me give you a sort of practical example, is that you can put... this is a very good practical example. People put mulch onto their around their fruit trees, onto their veggie garden, and inevitably we all sort of end up whinging and sort of saying, God, it disappeared so quickly. How come it disappeared so quickly? And I don't see any long-term benefit. And so what's happening with that? It is breaking down. And it is being, some of those nutrients are being used by the plants to obviously as nutrients. But the thing is, we now know that if we want to increase the amount of organic matter in our soil, we need to have it from the roots. We need to have it from dead and decaying roots, and we need to have it from root exudates, the sugars and proteins that plants put out through their roots. Nearly all plants do this, but I mean, I remember 20 odd years ago, or maybe a bit longer, but when scientists first realized that these plants were secreting sugars through their roots, they thought there was something wrong with the plant, and they called it the leaky root syndrome. Mm-hmm. And of course, now we know that it's basically the plant is changing the recipe to feed the soil organisms. And so the approach that we've had has been to sort of put inputs on, put mulch on, put compost on, rather than saying, what is it rather than saying the root cause of the problem is the ecosystem. So in the soil, if we want to increase organic matter, we're not going to do it just by putting mulch on the soil, but we are, because it breaks down. We're not even going to do it just by having a lot of roots in the soil. It's actually the soil organisms that do that work. And that is an ecological process.
It's interesting because the implication is, like, we're farming the plants, but the plants are farming the soil, or more accurately, the animals that live in the soil and regenerate it. So there's clearly a kind of relationship there. So this concept, this pattern, I suppose, of farming goes way down, really.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when if you look at the history of farming over the last 12,000 years, just as a general picture, there's obviously exceptions to this, particularly, you know, with indigenous farmers who've maintained self-fertilizing systems. What we've done is we've neglected the ecological parts of our production systems. So I sort of, when I'm sort of doing workshops and webinars and things like that, and you're talking particularly to farmers, we'll talk about their production systems. or we could talk about, let's say, a production system that's producing chocolate covered biscuits.
Okay.
And you know, there's a whole lot of raw materials that come into that production line, right? There's a whole lot of different bits of equipment and machinery that do different jobs, and out come the chocolate biscuits at the end. And at a garden scale, it's really no different. We have seeds, we have grafted fruit trees, we have weaners, we have, you know, whatever, livestock. A farmer will go in or a gardener will go in, they might dig their soil, they might plow their soil, they might spray herbicides, they may not, they might put compost on, they might put fertilizers on, the crop might come up, they might get some pest and disease problems, they might spray some stuff, and at the end, food comes out at the other end. But if you, like any production system, if you don't maintain it, and you know how everything is so much nowadays about efficiency. Yep. So it's about removing all, you know, how as a business or an organization can I save money by reducing sort of any sort of redundancy in a way. So any duplication in the system, that makes that so there's a couple of things that we know from what happens with production systems when they get run down, they're not maintained, is that they're more likely to break down. And going back to those chocolate covered biscuits, they're more likely to come out at the end of the production line without a proper coating of chocolate biscuits. Yeah. So if you have just keeping with that chocolate coated biscuit production line a bit longer, you know, if you've got that, your Arnold's or whatever, and you've got that happening, what are you going to do? Are you going to buy an extra piece of machinery and to put aside, pay somebody to pick out those biscuits that haven't been properly coated and then run them through an extra bit of machinery? Or are you going to look at your production system and see how it's working, what the problem is? And I think fundamentally, following that metaphor or analogy through, is that we've neglected the ecological components in our food production systems. And going back to the soil example, if you think about it, we've designed, you know, what manages the soil.
Oh, sorry. I thought you meant that rhetorically, but obviously, so I'm thinking earthworms and other microorganisms in the soil. So you know, you've got your myriad of other beasties, I suppose, in there that are in the relationship with the soil.
Yeah. Yes. And so they're basically the operators of the soil ecosystem. But if you think about the way that what we've done is let me widen it a little bit, is that we've basics, particularly over this last second, so I'm sort of rambling a little bit here, over the last particularly over the last 50 or so years, what we've done is we've designed our farms and gardens to mass produce a couple of crops and meat and dairy products. And that's our production systems. And what we've done is we're growing vegetation to feed, either to produce crops for us or grass and for livestock. And what we failed to do is think about the resources to the soil ecosystem, to the soil organisms.
Yeah. I'm following you.
Okay, so we don't, and so what happens what happens to us if we don't get fed enough food and good enough quality? We don't function.
So are you basically advocating organic farming or rewilding? And is there a difference? What would you mind?
No, I'm not advocating either of them. I'm actually just advocating, it's really interesting one, Matt. I'm advocating that we focus on repairing the ecosystems rather than treating the symptoms. So organic farming is an input-based system.
Right.
So you're not using
course.
superphosphate, you're using compost and
Yeah,
biological
mulch. Yeah.
fertilizers.
Yeah. Okay.
So what learning from nature and growing food eco-logically is about is how can we design our gardens and farms so that we repair the ecosystems within them.
Okay.
So, you know, we've talked for years about planting trees along the edges of our fields,
Yep.
along the creeks and things like that, and at the bottoms of our gardens. But and in the way that's sort of like bringing back those natural ecosystems into those edges of our production.
Yep.
But what I'm saying is that we need to bring those ecosystems, functioning ecosystems, back into our farms and gardens. So we talked about soils a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, you're not going to have a healthy soil structure that promotes root growth, nice deep roots, that promotes biodiverse communities of soil organisms without that functioning ecosystem. And we're not going to do that unless and this is where the simplicity is, because it's really just a matter of giving your soil organisms a better diet. In the old days, a lot of the farmers that you would engage with sustainable agriculture would be the ones who'd already paid off their mortgages and were a little bit more of a sort of have a greeny bent. But now I would say that the vast majority of farmers are more aware and more, more interested in what can I do to help? And this enables, this approach enables them to get involved without having to worry about sort of income losses, because profitability isn't just about yield; it's also about your net versus your gross.
Of course, yeah.
So, but the other thing too is that when you start growing food in functioning ecosystems, then you're bringing back all nature's free ecological services, and all of those other ecological services that ecosystems provide. So like clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, you're supplying naturally as a byproduct from repairing the ecosystems.